All right, everybody. Hello. What day is it today? Let me just check here. I was making. Is it in fact? Yes, it is. September 28th. And the video topic today is going to be for Venus square Uranus. And the Venus-Uranus dynamic has been in play for quite a while because Venus went retrograde over the summer, right? And Venus squared Uranus in a retrograde motion, and now, since Venus stationed direct, Venus is squaring Uranus again in direct motion. And my last video I recorded was about Libra, and I was made a video talking about Margaret Thatcher, Michel Foucault, and R.D. Laing, which I realize may have had that Uranus influence anyways, because it was like maybe a little bit more of a kind of a rebellious or kind of breaking the mold kind of video, right? It wasn't like your standard astrology video, so I may have been somewhat under the influence of Uranus for that one. And Venus is the ruler of Libra, so if you're talking about Libra while Venus is in a square to Uranus, maybe that makes sense that would kind of come in there, right? And I was thinking about, like, I don't want to dunk on Adam Ellenboss too hard. I mean, I have to admit that Adam Ellenboss was the guy that I learned astrology from, that I took a course from a number of years ago, and he's still my favorite astrologer. Like, if I'm just gonna go and like watch somebody's astrology videos, I'm gonna watch Adam Ellenboss's videos, and I think he's really good. But I have to admit that I was like the video that he did for Venus square Uranus, I thought it was a little bit like uninspired, or at least kind of like a little bit kind of playing it safe by the numbers a little bit. And like, one of the things, he was kind of approaching it from this angle of like, like get back into using dating apps, or like, fashion makeover, or, it was kind of like, these are kind of like, so I mean, there's something about this that, I don't know, it could just be me and my position in life and where I find myself, but I'm realizing that there was a certain kind of story playing out during this whole Venus retrograde and the square to Uranus, and now, while Venus is in direct motion squaring Uranus, there definitely seems to be certain things happening. And like, one of these things too is that, like, I realize that I kind of get into this pattern of I don't know, like, either, I don't want to just go on these videos and lament being lonely or being isolated or something like that, but I kind of realized that, like, even if I did have certain things going on with certain people or certain friends, like, I may, even if things were going on, I may not really want to put them on, just make make my whole life public on a YouTube video, right? So, I mean, I guess, like, but there's something about, like, actually understanding the archetypes as they're playing out that requires a certain personal involvement, right? And what can I say? Like, there's certain things that happened during the Venus retrograde period that was like a friend of mine, a good friend of mine, who moved away but would often come back and visit, at various points in times, paid me a visit. Although it was like, other times when he would visit, we used to go to like rock shows, and we used to do a few things while he was in town. But it was really like, there was, it was like just one visit, and there was, I mean, the circumstances of it with COVID and with being here because of his dad dying, maybe I could understand it's a bit of a different context. Or it could also be this kind of thing that, I don't know. But like, one of the things when I was hanging out with him, we went to get some sushi. And when we were in the sushi restaurant, there was a poster up in the sushi restaurant for this festival that they were having, they were going to have in Ladner. And like, where I live, the biggest local Canadian band from the area where I live is this band called 5440. And my dad even had a music studio at one point in time, and like 5440 recorded some demos in his studio. So I always had this sort of like personal kind of, I don't really know the band that well or anything, but it's sort of like I kind of felt like the kind of like the Canadiana of Canadian rock. You know, I was kind of just joking to my friend a little bit that would be like, you know, they're like, it would be kind of cool to see 5440. But then there's this, when they did play, it was one of these things where they were just walking distance from my house, and apparently there was like a crowd of maybe like 10,000 people there when they played. And during this time, I decided to just not talk about this in my astrology channel and just kind of like, and not get too hung up on it. But for some, like, I'm kind of drawn to talk about some of this stuff right now in terms of like Venus standing for things like friends and art and music and all. It seems to be coming up for me anyways. Or at least for some reason, you like just talking to people online. There seems like there's conversations that have really started getting going about this whole thing about like, you know, collecting music gear or something like that, right? But in like a kind of more interesting conversation than what you would normally have about these topics, right? I have to like this for me. There's this kind of interesting thing with in the context of COVID, and that people are going out to shows, people are going out to concerts again, and for the first time in a long time, I'm starting to experience what people would call like FOMO, I guess, like the fear of missing out, and I kind of like. I also this is where it kind of comes into me, this kind of influence of Uranus, is that I feel like, you know, Uranus could be like kind of things like what was previously suppressed by the whole corona pandemic, as things are bursting out into the open again, right? But at the same time, it's kind of like there's this quality going on that like earlier in the year I saw that there's a concert. There's 3 bands that I really liked as a teenager going on tour together, which were Modest Mouse, the Pixies, and Cat Power. And I have to admit that when I was a teenager, I got into the Pixies, who are long since broken up, and started listening to their music and getting really into them. And then they had, in perfect timing, around the time I graduated high school, the Pixies went on a reunion tour, which I never thought was going to happen, and I got really excited for it. And I went to the Pixies reunion tour with a bunch of friends, but you know what? To be honest, like for the amount of investment that I had in enjoying the Pixies and then seeing them live, it was like, I wasn't going to say that it's like they did a terrible show or something like that, but it was like I could tell that they had aged a lot since they recorded their records. They'd aged a bit since their heyday, and it wasn't like quite the kind of manic intensity that I was hoping for. That like the Frank Black just like screaming and howling and stuff. Like he's like, no, Frank Black's, or whatever what his name is, Black Francis or whoever. You know, he's mellowed out a little bit, I can tell, right? And now they're continuing to write new music and put out new Pixies records, but I haven't been paying attention. And likewise, Modest Mouse was one of my favorite bands, so I have to. There's this kind of like a little bit of regret of like not seeing both the Pixies and Modest Mouse and Cat Power on the same bill. But again, I was starting to just reflect on this whole situation and the way that like there's a certain identification that comes with this stuff, right? In that like it's like, especially in a consumer culture, they have all these things that are like cultural commodities, and like buying records or like buying stuff or buy the t-shirt and you identify as being a fan of a certain band or something like that. And one of the things that I have been interested in is like I've been taking these courses from Weird Studies and reading a bunch of books and stuff like this, and one of the ideas that I picked up from these Weird Study courses is this thing about radical alterity, or the essential otherness of things. And that I was basically just reflecting on like what it was like when I first got into this music. And I have, like, there's the whole well, I won't get to the whole hipster thing of like I was into this band before they were cool or something, but the specific thing about like being in, like people talk about how sometimes people go through like music death, they call it, where like when you're in your mid 20s or something like that, you stop going to shows or you stop seeing bands and you stop paying attention to new music coming out, and you get into it just becomes a kind of a nostalgia trip for like certain bands you liked back in high school or something like that. And there's something about the idea of like how we relate to music or music scenes and stuff like that. And for me, I remember when I was in high school, there was this like pivotal moment where I was. Let me think about the exact order of things. I guess it was kind of like, like there was this time where I met like a girl who was into punk rock at like this sort of like summer camp thing, and that kind of influenced me to go see some all ages shows or whatever. But there was this time when I was in I think it was grade 11, or was it grade 10? I can't remember. Maybe it was grade 10, like something like that, in humanities. And I was seated at a table. Like you had this class where instead of having everybody like having individual desks lined up in a row, you had these kind of like group tables where you were situated at these different group tables. And I was at an all-male group table. And if you can imagine what like 15-year-old, 16-year-old high school males are like and what they talk about, meaning a lot of like video games or I don't know, like nerdy stuff. Like I was basically having this sort of sense of like being of dissatisfaction, being stuck at this table of like I'm really not being interested in the kind of people who I was organized with, and then having this moment, the specific moment of inspiration to like that was fueled by this kind of sense of discontentment sitting at this table, to be like, what happens if I like ask the table over there that is like a table of like, it's just a few girls, and it's like this table of all boys and a table of just like a few girls. What would happen if I asked the table of girls if I could sit at the girl table, and the girls at the girl table let me sit at the girl table, and then I got to talking with the girls. And one of these said girls was getting into the sort of like the indie music scene, and subsequently this girl, she ended up, influencing my music taste quite a bit. But I think upon that initial like jumping tables, she was like, "Oh, hey, there's some all ages shows going on. Do you want to come with us to go see some rock bands and all this kind of stuff?" And there's a little bit of irony here, because some of these male friends that were at the male table ended up later on kind of getting into some of this music and going out to these shows and stuff like this. But for me, it was very much like, I don't know if any of this would have happened if I didn't get sick of hanging out with this one group of friends and trying to talk to some cute girls and finding out about some rock shows to go to. And then in that context, this is where I found out about, like, I don't think I even knew about Modest Mouse until that point, right? But finding out from Modest Mouse, from the person who's at the table that you talk to, and then meeting other people who are more into this band and getting filled in on different, and it's also like, so it's not like you're like having an identity is not just like, this is my identity as opposed to all these other people, but like you're in a social situation, and then the bands don't just exist in a vacuum. It's not like you're like just being all like, oh, I'm gonna go on my phone and like let Spotify recommend something to me, or like I'm gonna have an algorithm tell me what music it thinks I would like. There's a more organic social element to being like you know, like you, or like a lot of it came from this friend of mine who is like a few years older. That I actually, when I first met him, he wasn't really friends of mine, but he would like drive me and a friend of mine to school. He was like the friend of an older brother or whatever, right? And and just being like, what is this music you're playing in the car, right? And like having these like exposure to music being coming out of a certain social situation. And it's not to say that like, oh, this is like I've found my thing, this is like I you know, in some respects there was like, you know, maybe I don't know. It's like I don't want to also like play it up as this like this is real. You know, you find your place where you belong, and then now you get to identify as being like I'm a true fan of this band because I, you know, have a bunch. But it was back in those days. The experience of going to shows was like you had a like oftentimes you might be getting on the bus to go to the all ages rock show with a group of maybe like, you know, like it could just be you and a couple of friends, or sometimes it could be like a group of 10 people, and like maybe not everybody even like knows each other, but like you're all into the same band and you're having this little like gaggle of like kids all going to go to the rock show, right? And so it's like these are the kind of things like the whole thing about like going to go see the Pixies and Modest Mouse and Cat Power on tour is kind of like it's, you know, it's like compared to that situation of like when I was a teenager, when I was getting to this music, the music belonging to a certain time and place. Now it's kind of like just to me, it just seems like a nostalgia thing, something that would remind me of those times. And the thing is, the bands, Modest Mouse has been putting out albums that I have just not been paying attention to because I'm not in that same situation anymore, right? And it's like that I remember like when I was living in Nanaimo, I met a guy I started talking to Modest Mouse about, and he's like, "Oh, do you know this album? Do you know this song?" I'm like, "I don't know this. Like, I don't know these songs because I just like my life ended up going a different direction, and it was like because this music just wasn't relevant in the same way as it was, right? Because it's sort of like it exists in the world in a certain social situation, and then you know, and now what my like I posted on my Facebook like I shared the link and be like, man, if I was like 17-year-old me would be just like losing it for these three bands on tour, and then having my you know, one of my friends from back in high school saying, "Oh yeah, maybe we could go to this," and then you know nothing happens. I mean, but the whole thing is like I don't want to be like I have the FOMO thing of like if I really wanted to go to the show, I'd go to the show, and I don't want to be hung up on not going to it, right? But this is the whole thing about Uranus that I feel the influence of Uranus here, right? Is like I don't think Uranus, if anything that Uranus stands for, like nostalgia or being stuck doing the same shit you did when you were a teenager in high school, I don't think that's Uranus at all. I think that if anything, Uranus is kind of like, you know, if you're the kind of person who just listens to the same music that they have always listened to for the last 20 years, and you're going to go see like a band who are, you know, at one time was kind of vital and popular, and now they're just kind of like a bunch of geriatric old people playing the predictable hits for the whole crowd to sing along to. It's kind of, there's something about that that's like, this isn't Uranus. This isn't Uranus at all. So there's this thing about it that is like the idea. There's almost, I relate to it anyways, of a kind of a spirit, the attitude of like kill your idols in a way, right? Or like the idea of like to like we don't want to just get stuck doing the same thing over and over again, and like I don't want music to be a nostalgia trip, right? Like to be like I can think another example of this is that I watched a documentary on Marky Smith recently, right? I was sort of like surprised and a little bit shocked to see that they mentioned the fall and pavement in the Barbie movie. because I maybe felt like a bit of a personal attack because these are bands that I would listen to, right? Being and like the whole the Barbie movie kind of being prefigured again. There's a sort of thing about like men and their sense of superior music taste, and men are like, oh, I'm a snobby, I've got the superior indie taste, and I get to lecture to women who don't know anything about band. I gotta remind you that for me, this doesn't really make sense because like I said, I was hanging out at the nerd table with all the nerd boys, and I only got into indie music from cool girls telling me what the bands were like. You know what I mean? Like it wasn't like so. I don't know. There's something about the this whole sort of division between like, oh yeah, girls just like Beyonce and boys like indie music. That wasn't my lived experience actually growing up, or the influences that got me into this stuff in the first place, right? That's not really my experience. But anyways, what am I trying to say here? Marky Smith and the Fall. The thing about like, I also really like this band Gang of Four, but like as much as I like Gang of Four reunited, and they basically just play their one really good album. Like it's just the guitar player, and they have a bunch of young guys, and they just do basically regurgitate their one good album. I have to admit, it is a really good album. Gang of Four Entertainment is an amazing album, but what I love about Marky Smith is that Marky Smith just kept going. He didn't get stuck in this thing where he's had this we have our one thing and we're just gonna redo this over and over and over. Like, in a way, he never stopped being the Fall, but he kept coming up with new stuff, the vital creative energy, right? Trying to keep doing something new, right? And so it's kind of like, I don't know. At the same time, when it comes to like electronic music and stuff like that, right? Like for me, electronic music and like the rave scene or whatever you would say about it, it felt refreshing because when it went with this whole indie thing, it was like I was going to shows as a teenager with these groups of friends, and then as I was into my 20s, I started to find the situation like just going to shows alone, and you're just like, you're in a crowd of people and you're just like standing there with a beer just watching the band, not talking to anybody, and kind of like this isn't really that fun, right? And then at least there was kind of like or like I don't know, this is really, it kind of feels like this is kind of getting off track, but this whole the whole point of the electronic music was that it was like it helped to feel like I wasn't so stuck in identifying with a certain genre or a certain style, or that I was more fluid and flexible, and if something like more fresh or new was happening, you could try something else out or something like that. But it was all kind of like, a lot of it was sort of relevant to where I was at in my life at that particular time, relevant to what kind of people I was hanging out with, and it fit into a greater social scene or a greater social thing going on. And now in this kind of thing, it's like, I just like, as a guy who's like, I'm gonna turn 37 this year, and one of the things that Marky Smith was saying in his like, Marky Smith was famous for firing his bandmates, or that he like the Fall, the treating the musicians in the Fall as being somewhat disposable, or that rather than that the lineup would always change every few years. And Marky Smith was just kind of saying that it was like in the documentary that like like once people reach that age where they're getting in their 30s and they have kids and they have different priorities, that it's like it wasn't so much him firing them as they dismissed themselves, right? And I think for me this kind of reminds of being in this state where I'm in my mid-30s, I'm not a teenager anymore, I'm not going out to all ages shows, I'm not, and and then we have the whole COVID pandemic thing coming in the middle of this, that it's kind of like, it's sort of like, the whole idea of music, it seems to be, it's sort of like, it no longer relates to the actual real life that I experience day to day but rather either it's a sentimentality trip for a bunch of people who are no longer present in my life, or else it's like a fantasy or something like that, right? And the thing about, like, what I find kind of cool about Marky Smith, it was in that documentary they were talking about how Marky Smith's writing process would be like, he would be kind of a documentarian in a way, right? Like, he would be composing his lyrics based on things that were going on in the neighborhood, or like he would go out for a walk and then he would talk about things that he saw that day. There's something that got brought up in some of these weird studies, or like in the latest, or whatever. There's this thing about the schizophrenic walk, right? Where the world you inhabit is not just a geographic world, but it's a psychological world. It's a world of psyche, or that your music isn't just something that sort of exists in a vacuum. Your music is sort of like a communication or a dialogue with the environment, that you're always that you're in conversation with something that is actually going on in real life. And that, Marky Smith has this famous song, I Am Damo Suzuki, in reference to the krautrock band Can. And Can would be like this too, in the sense that, like, if you are playing music, you're playing an instrument and you are listening to what's going on in the environment around you, and your music is feeding in, your music is in some way an expression of the social, cultural moment that you find yourself in. And I'm sort of like, to me, it's sort of like, I'm experiencing this as a kind of like, I don't know, I don't want to say crisis, but as a kind of a creative block, because it's sort of like, and it was, ever since they had this festival where 5440 played, and I didn't go, and now that, this whole sense that summer's over, and like, did I, waste my summer by not doing anything through the summer, right? But it's sort of like, I don't know, I wouldn't want to go, I don't know if I really want to be in a crowd of 10,000 strangers watching 5440 anyways, right? Or that, not at least without a crew, you know what I mean? Like, or like, how many, or I don't know if that would make it better or worse. But like, what am I trying to get at here? Like, this kind of thing that, like, like, I can't, like, I don't even know, like, I don't want to be that hung up on a specific identity of being a musician, because I see, especially with COVID, there's a lot of people who have been affected by this, but they have such a fixed sense of identity, right? Like, there's some people that, like, if you're a drummer, you're like, this is what I am. I'm flesh and blood, born to drum. Or maybe not, like, but like, this kind of idea that, like, you can be flexible. You don't have to be one thing. You can do all sorts of different stuff. You don't. But I like, there's something about my life, like, my dad was a guitar player, and I've inherited all his instruments, and like, I don't see myself as being much of a musician, really, right? I don't really identify as the guy who'd go to open mic and sing a song and play guitar, right? But there's something about music that I just can't, like, for one thing, I can't seem to shake it, right? I can't seem to just be like, I can't fathom being like, I'm going to sell all my musical instruments, I'm going to just get rid of all my stuff and just forget about it and not bother with music at all, right? But at the same time, it's like, when it feels like I'm just looking after a bunch of stuff that doesn't have any, it doesn't make sense. Like, what is this stuff doing here? How does this stuff relate to the situation that I'm in? How does this stuff, like musical instruments, relate to the environment that I'm in? And like, the thing is, if you're just going to be like, oh, I'm going to take these guitars and learn the same songs that everybody learns, and play Oasis Wonderwall or something like that, or I'm going to go and see all the bands that I used to go see in high school. Well, it's not, I'm not a teenager in high school anymore. Or like, that I'm saying, like, you have to create from the present moment. You have to create from where you're at. And like, isn't it like, there's this sort of sense with rock and roll that like the whole idea of rock music got popular when the baby boomers were teenagers, right? And then you could see as the baby boomers aged, the music kind of evolved, and then like maybe you had grunge rock being like the music of Gen X or something like that. And now we have this sort of cultural moment where the millennials are all adults and the millennials are all having kids and all this kind of stuff. But like, you know, this kind of thing, like I kind of relate to this in some kind of way, like if somebody asked me what I wanted, and they said, Dan, would you rather, like, have a wife that you have a bunch of kids with and you settle down and become an adult, or would you rather play in a rock and roll band? I'd probably choose playing in a rock and roll band. Like, I really don't, you know, the idea of having, like, a family that you're committed to looking after and that you're, you know, I'm going to put away all the childish things so I can be responsible. Like, don't get me wrong, too, because, like, I'm not drinking alcohol anymore, and I'm not particularly interested in, like, the hard drug party lifestyle like that, right? Like, but I don't want to, you know, there's something about the idea of being, like, a parent that is really not very appealing to me. And there's all this stuff that like people are like, well, we don't go out anymore because we're mature parents. Like, well, I mean, I guess maybe parents do actually go. Like, this is the kind of thing is that it could actually very well be that people who are adults with parents who like may actually, you know, husband and wife go out to rock shows and do things and have a babysitter look after their kids. And meanwhile, I'm just a single guy who just stays at home and has a fucking mental breakdown about it, right? So, that's kind of how I feel about it, right? Like, I don't really, you know, but like, this whole kind of like, Uranus, if anything, I feel like is supposed to be a kind of like a creative breakthrough. And in a way, at least I'm having some interesting conversations with people, but there's something about it where it's like, you know, what's the point of this if it doesn't actually relate to my life, where I'm at right now and what I'm doing in my life, right? And I feel what I'm trying to get at with this whole Venus square Uranus thing is like all these things that are invested into the past, right? Where it's like, it feels like I want something, you know, when the whole thing is just a dialogue with ghosts that are haunting you rather than the actual reality that you're faced with. You get up in the morning and being like, this is who I am. Never mind who I was when I was a teenager. Who am I today? And what kind of music would that person make? What kind of music would that person listen to, right? And it's like, does it make sense for me to go out to rock and roll clubs pretending that, you know, trying to chase the life that I had when I was a teen? Like, to be honest, like, I don't want to seem like it was. I don't know. I guess my teenage years weren't that bad. I should just be grateful for, you know, how they were and all this kind of stuff. But I am not really interested in trying to chase some sentimental nostalgia trip. I want to live my life that is actually the life in the present moment, right? And I think creativity, you know, you can't make you're always making something right now. You can't just be like, I'm going to take a time machine back 20 years ago and do the teenage rock band that I should have done when I was a teenager. It doesn't work. I can't go back and be a teenager. I have to be a 37-year-old man who has guitars to play. You know, and it doesn't really make sense because it doesn't connect with anything in my life. And yeah, I don't know. There's a whole thing about coronavirus too. Although, you know, like, I don't know. I'm going to get into all that right now. You know, there's probably more that I could say about the Venus-Uranus thing, but this is what's coming up right now. This is what I feel like is relevant to talk about, so I guess I'll just upload this video. Okay, thanks. Thanks for watching. Thanks for your supporting my funny astrology channel. Okay.